Thank you, Andrew. Has anybody else got a question for Andrew?
Rob, I'd just like to congratulate Andrew on that presentation. Andrew, I was particularly interested in your explanation of the storage opportunities. I'm interested in pumped hydro, and I thought it was versus batteries, but you've got me thinking now that it's not a either or, it's a combination of both. They complement each other. My question is around the cost, ongoing cost. I can't see much area in the pumped hydro for cost reductions into the future. Batteries, I think, is more open to more efficient batteries, cheaper batteries. What's your view of the long-term, perhaps, competition between the two? Where do you think it'll end up? I am a little bit concerned that it might
Can
go.
you wait for a little while? I'm in a meeting.
Yeah, she's in a meeting, but I'm a bit worried we might overdo the pump storages because of the cost comparison right at this very minute.
I don't think so. No matter how cheap batteries get, the battery chemistry will be not within cooey of the cost of water. They are highly complementary. So batteries can respond in sub-seconds. Pumped hydro sort of can because it's got heavy rotational inertia because it's got a heavy spinning generator, just like a coal-fired power station's got. But really, batteries are very interesting for sub-seconds up to about an hour. Car batteries are very interesting because the battery is essentially already paid for because you wanted a car. But if you want hours to days of storage to cover wind lulls and solar lulls in a wet windless week in winter, then you'll be mighty glad if you've got a Snow 2.0 and a Tasmania battery of your nation and so forth. If you live in North Queensland, you put a whacking great pumped hydro up there, which means that your cable south from the wonderful solar and wind around Townsville, the cable south can run 24/7 at full load, so that you send some of the solar down the cable during the day and send the rest of it to the pumped hydro, and then in the middle of the night the pumped hydro shoves it down the cable. If you live in similarly, if you live in North Queensland or Tasmania or South Australia and the cable goes down, you'll be mighty glad to have a pumped hydro locally because it'll give you 12, 24 hours of energy storage to keep your grid operating until the transmission line can be reestablished. So it's horses for courses. Both are going to be interesting. And the operational cost of, for overnight storage, operational cost of pumped hydro is between a factor of 5 and 10 times cheaper than batteries will be in a few years' time. It's just no comparison in costs for large-scale storage. And just remember that Snow 2.0 has more energy storage than all of the batteries in the whole world put together.
Mike's got a question.
Andrew.
Come on.
Andrew, just playing around with your REMI map, and I'm having a look at Euroa, and Euroa's got two storages. It's got one that directly feeds the town, and it's got an upper storage, and they're already connected by the look of it by a pipeline. So I'm assuming that in that particular case, it would merely be an exercise in building some sort of a power station with a pump at the bottom that would almost turn that into a renewable storage, a pumped hydro situation. And we would have lots and lots of those cases through water districts all over the country.
You might. What counts as the altitude difference? If the altitude difference is too small, you can't afford, even if the reservoirs are free and the tunnel is already there, you can't afford to put the electromechanical equipment in.
Yep.
So you have to look at the height difference, and almost certainly the connecting pipe is far too small for a pumped hydro. So you'd have to actually, all you get is the two reservoirs, and I don't know how big they are, and I don't know what the altitude difference is. So we did a greenfield survey because we can use Landsat data to find out the local geography. We are in the process now of doing a brownfield survey, where we're going to look around each and every one of the reservoirs in Australia, existing reservoirs, and each and every one of the existing mining pits to find out whether we can skip one or both of the reservoirs in this or that place. But
Excuse me, Andrew, could you turn your screen sharing off, thanks?
I'm sorry, yes.
That's right.
It's just the brownfield survey will be finished in about 6 months' time, and so we'll then sort of close the loop.
Derek here. Andrew, you haven't mentioned hydrogen power at all. I wonder where hydrogen fits into the picture here, both in terms of a transport fuel and for storage. How does it compete with pumped hydro for storage, and what are the opportunities in Northern Australia for export of hydrogen in connection with production of renewable energy?
The chemical symbol for hydrogen is H, and that stands for hype. The fact is that hydrogen is an absolutely appalling way of storing energy because it's got a round trip efficiency of about 1/4. That means you take wind and solar electricity, you make hydrogen in an electrolyzer. Somehow or other you store that hydrogen or transport it. Then you put it back through a fuel cell, and by the time you've got the electricity back or the motive power in a hydrogen car, you've thrown away 3/4 of the energy. People don't use hydrogen for very good reason. People don't use chemical storage for energy storage unless they have to. It's just awful. So the notion that we're going to export hydrogen to Japan is just absolutely farcical. The fact is, I mean, we're doing a study in Japan, a detailed study in Japan now of what their renewable energy options are. There are 3 options for them. One is throw a cable across the Sea of Japan to China or Mongolia, and they'll probably do that, though they won't want to rely too heavily on that in case of geopolitical tensions. They could import Australian or Middle Eastern or US ammonia or hydrogen, or name your hydrogen containing energy vector, at appalling efficiency and hence very high cost. Or they can use their own homegrown solar and wind. And Japan has fabulous wind, offshore wind. And Japan also has enormous solar, as it turns out. And it's got more pumped hydro than any other country on Earth, and it's got enormous pumped hydro opportunities for further pumped hydro development. It turns out that if you put PV on, if you put solar panels on mounts about 2 or 3 meters high on rice paddies, covering 40% of the rice paddy, you only lose about 10% of the rice production, because rice production is constrained by many things, not just sunlight. And that means that all flat land in Japan is available for cash cropping, a second cash crop, through hosting solar farms. And it turns out that if we covered all of Japan's rice paddies, 40% of each of them, with solar panels, we'd have about 5 times more electricity than we'd actually need in Japan. And then if we covered all of Japan's territorial water with wind turbines, we'd have 5 or 10 times as much wind power as we need. In short, Japan is not short of renewable energy, and they're going to get their energy from there because it's much, much, much cheaper than importing it from somewhere else, and it's without the geopolitical tensions. And after COVID, I think people are going to be much more focused on homegrown everything.
Excuse me, Alan Wilson's got a question, Andrew.
Yeah. You're muted.
You're on mute, Alan.
Andrew, your scheme, does it require a transmission line to Western Australia?
It doesn't, although the West Australians would be very happy to get one. Going from Adelaide to Western Australia doesn't help the eastern states, but it helps the West mightily, because virtually all the wind and solar farms are in the same place. They're all within a few hundred kilometres of each other around Perth. And that means that a wet, windless week in winter is a disaster. Whereas in Australia, we cover 1 million square kilometres, East Australia, I mean. And so, a gloomy, still week in Melbourne doesn't mean it's gloomy and still in New South Wales or Queensland. I just need to revert briefly back to hydrogen. Hydrogen will be important in the long term because we need to make ammonia for fertilizers and explosives and all the rest. We need to make plastics. We might need to make synthetic jet fuel, all of which have got hydrogen. Hydrogen as a chemical precursor is essential. As a storage or transport energy medium, it's useless.
Toyota and other companies are introducing fleets of hydrogen cars, and they've got a plant down in Melbourne. You think that's not going to be the right direction, Andrew?
Well, just go and look at the relative size of the market for electric vehicles versus hydrogen vehicles. I don't know whether it's a factor of 100 or it's 1,000, but it's a very, very large ratio. Electric vehicles won, and some companies just need to get over it. It's like beta VHS, but one format wins, the other loses.
Any other questions?
Here, Andrew, from Graham Hannigan. What's the future for tidal and wave energy?
Nil. I mean, PV and wind have just so comprehensively won the race. I believe the amount of tidal in the world is 40 megawatts or something like that. The amount of PV and wind is more than 1 million megawatts. And PV and wind are growing and tidal's going nowhere. And as for wave, I don't think there's any wave in the world.
Right,
It just lost. The same as nuclear fusion lost. Nuclear fission lost. Nuclear fusion will be ready in 50 years' time. At least it was when I started physics in the 1970s, and it still is 50 years away. It's lost before it even started. And coal and gas are about to lose as well on even sunk cost existing coal and gas.
Right. I just think that tidal doesn't stop. It's there day and night.
But it does. There's slack water twice a day. And it's a very, very hostile environment. There's salt water, there's marine growth, there's it's just really, really hard. There's very few places that have got strong tidal streams or large tides, and they are often, national parks. I mean, you could go and put a tidal generator in twin horizontal falls, and I'll oppose you every step of the way.
What about you, Mick? You got a question? No question from Mick.
You mean Mick or Mike?
Oh no! Sorry, we've got a Mick up there too, and he said no. So, anybody else?
Yeah. All right, you go, Alan. I'll go after you.
Just another question about pumped hydro in these small storages. The water is all allocated and it has to be bought back, so it's going to be competitive with agriculture.
Pumped hydro will, you need very little water, but the value of water in pumped hydro will be 1,000 times per litre with the value in agriculture. There'll be no problem whatsoever in buying water for $1 billion gigawatt scale pumped hydro system.
So it is competitive. It takes water away from agriculture, buys it off agriculture.
It stores it for 100 years in your new reservoirs, and in 100 years' time you can let it out again, I suppose. But in actual fact, because it'll take a couple of years to build the reservoirs, in most places, if you simply build a cofferdam nearby just to hold water, and you build the lower reservoir first or the upper, then you can probably harvest enough water from the landscape to basically fill your reservoir by the time the rest of the scheme is finished. It's only in a high desert like, say, South Australia, Flinders Ranges, northern Flinders Ranges, that you'd have a problem. And the amount of water is so small, it's 10 litres per person. That's 1 minute of shower. So, okay, everyone's got to have 1 minute less shower on one day. And that's all the water you need for the next 100 years.
That's not a very good comparison. It's how much water you're going to need to take away from agriculture.
Of the order of...
how many gigalitres?
400 gigalitres over the next 100 years.
I don't see the 100-year bit. It's going to evaporate.
No, in most cases, rainfall on the reservoir would replace evaporation. In those places where it doesn't, you can put evaporation suppressors, which is basically floating plastic balls, which reduce evaporation rate by 90%, and again, tilts the balance in favour of rainfall. And 400 gigalitres over 100 years is 40 gigalitres a year, which is a very, very, very small amount of water compared with what agriculture takes.
Simon had a question.
Andrew, a couple of questions. One regarding back to hydrogen for a moment and long-range shipping. I've heard a lot of discussion around the use in replacing fossil fuels for ships. As future there. And the second question, back to stored pumped hydro, is saltwater still a problem for that? Presumably you get elevation near the coastline, have an unlimited amount of water available. I assume that there's still problems in the technology managing saltwater. Your thoughts would be helpful.
Okay, so shipping at the moment uses bunker oil. Ammonia could be a very, very good drop-in fuel, but that's about 1% or so of global emissions. It's a very small but important thing that we'll deal with in the 30s and 40s. We don't have to deal with it now. As far as saltwater and pumped hydro, I can't think of anywhere in the whole of Australia where high hills meet the sea outside a national park. And
right.
For heaven's sake, even if you found such a place, you would not put saltwater through a precision turbine. You would, if you were using salt water, you would put it through a deionizer first and use fresh water. The moment you put salt water through one of these systems, the price doubles because the manufacturers will be unsure about whether the guarantees, etc., will hold.
Okay. I've got a question from Greg Barnes, Andrew.
Andrew, no news scheme is perfect. What do you think the unintended consequences would be of all this? Like, they were very happy when they got rid of the horses out of New York City in 1900s and had cars, but there was a few unintended consequences there, and also with electricity, etc.
It's very hard to think of unintended consequences with the silicon solar cell. Silicon is the #1 element of the Earth's crust. Glass is made of silicon dioxide, which are #1 and #2 elements in the Earth's crust. The capsulant is plastic, which is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which we're not going to run out of. Then there's an aluminium frame, which you can have almost 100% recycling thereof at the end of panel life. The area of panel per person required to supply enough solar electricity to meet all energy, not electricity needs, is 60 square meters per person. 60 square meters. That's about a third of a typical house. So a 3-person household, the roof thereof is roughly the area of solar panel those 3 people need to supply all of their share of all the energy used in Australia and drive all oil, gas and coal out of Australia. There's no waste problem whatsoever. There's no material supply problem. There's no security issues. You get rid of all of the carbon dioxide emissions and the methane emissions, and you get rid of smog and pollution, and it's just a fantastic solution for the next billion or so years. Fantastic.
Excuse me, Alan, we've got a question from John Pettigrew.
It's more a comment, Andrew. Just a word of caution. The questioning coming from Alan Wilson, it has credit on the availability of water. It's certainly in the Murray-Darling Basin, where most of us operate, it's political dynamite at the moment. But I'm with your presentation, the one area that concerned me was the spread of pumped hydro, predominantly on private land. I think we can do this. No one's pushed renewables harder than me over the last decade, but I have a concern from both water availability, building extra dams, but also some environmental aspects. Even though this is private land, most of those are going to be on streams, I suspect. And I'm convinced we can do it, but we need to be careful, Andrew.
Just remember that the number of pumped hydro systems in Victoria that you'd need would be like 2 in the whole of Victoria. Yeah. Then the area of lake required for the whole country for 100% renewables is of the order of 40 or 50 square kilometres. a couple of square meters per person on average. And that's about 30 to 50 times smaller area of land than the corresponding land that you need for the solar and wind farms. So that the land is not an issue. If you can, if you're going to build solar and wind farms that actually require the pumped hydro support, then you'll find a little bit of extra land for the pumped hydro. None of it will be on rivers, and none of it will be in the stressed downstream areas because it's all too flat. They'll be up in the mountains. And importantly, the amount of water that you need is a factor of more than 5 less than the current electricity system needs. If you go to wherever there is a coal-fired power station, you'll see these huge cooling towers emitting vast amounts of steam. Well, they're all gone. And that water is 5 times more than you need to run the pumped hydro system.
Andrew, we have a question from Mick 8. Thank you.
Andrew, I think many of us who listen to you today are surprised to hear some of the things you're telling us. I'm wondering, where are you going from here in terms of, if this is the story that needs to get out, how do we get it out, and what are you doing to get it out? Is your university backing you? And what's the future for changing that story?
Well, that's one of the reasons I do seminars like this. And Robert was very kind to amplify my voice, I guess, through a podcast. And I'm very far from being the only person who is saying these sorts of things. I do about 100 outreach activities each year. This is one of 100. And some are smaller scale and some are larger scale. One of the good things about speaking to a relatively small number of people like this is that these people are interested and they're willing to put the time in to attend, and many of them might be willing to put the time in to read further and come up and then absorb the message and relay it. I mentioned one thing you can do, subversive, put lots of PV on your roof. And the other subversive things you can do is actually go and tell people that actually this is not very hard. And furthermore, if you live in an area like Shepparton, which has got pretty good solar, I don't know about the wind in Shepparton, probably not so good, but support the local company when it turns up and says, "Are you willing to allow us to put a wind farm, or a solar farm, or a wind farm on your property?" Take a little bit of your land, lease it, and put it there. Support them. I mean, this is local jobs. It's fantastic.
Andrew, we've got another question from John Pettigrew.
Probably another comment, Andrew, sorry, but we would love to put more solar farms in the Golden Valley. Unfortunately, we have the Victorian government who won't allow solar farms in irrigation regions, and it's absolute madness at the moment. So we have a few challenges here, and that is certainly one of them. I would have thought at the moment we should be pushing hard, all of us, for interconnection of our grid services. I think it's a wonderful, dare I say, nation building exercise after COVID-19. And that's where a lot of our efforts, I think, should be.
Yes, a link to Tasmania is very useful because it looks like it's going to be politically possible. Tasmania is not the first place you'd put a large-scale cable, but if you're going to do it, then you get access to wind in Tasmania, which is not very well correlated with wind in Victoria. That's really good. It means that when there's a wind lull in one place, it doesn't mean there's a wind lull in the other. The very first place you need a strong cable to between New South Wales and South Australia. A toy gigawatt cable is being put in. It should be 2 or 3 gigawatts. And then the other place that a really strong cable should be put in is to Townsville. Townsville's got fabulous wind and solar, which is strongly counter-correlated with the wind and solar in the south. And of course, putting it into Townsville is good politically. So putting a 10 gigawatt cable into Townsville at the cost of maybe $4 or $5 billion would free up about $20 or $30 billion in construction costs of the cable, the PV, the wind, and the pumped hydro in North Queensland. So that's where I would go.
Yeah. Thank you.
Another question from Simon.
Andrew, just while I've got you here, what's your views on Ross Garnaut's new book, Australia has a Superpower? Just the technology of it and the way he's framed it.
Moonshine. Everyone's got access to the sun and the wind. How are we going to export what everyone's got? I mean, can we get a big business exporting air to Japan or wherever? I mean, everyone's got solar and wind. There are a few countries like Singapore, which obviously you're not going to do locally, but nearly everybody else has got it. I mean, is Indonesia really going to take a significant amount of solar and wind power via a cable from Australia? Why would they? They've got non-seasonal solar. It's there every day of the year. They don't have much wind. Their solar is not as good as Australia, but for the most part, they're not going to want to rely on another country. I mean, COVID is really going to change these notions that you rely on foreign suppliers for essential services. People are going to go out and hunt for the local wind and solar, and there's not going to be much for export. There is the possibility of export of products.
Yeah.
And the big one that's talked about is iron. So the notion that you don't export iron oxide to China, but you export iron. Will China really allow its iron and steel industry to ship out to the Pilbara? I mean, your geopolitical analysis is as good as mine, but I'm somewhat skeptical.
So what's behind Garnaut's preoccupation with hydrogen, do you think? He seems to be quite convinced by it.
Well, I'm a technologist. I look at the facts. Hydrogen is an appalling way of storing energy. It's a rotten way of transporting energy, but we will need it in the 30s and 40s as a chemical component for plastic and ammonia and the like. But for heaven's sake, the 20s should be engaged in the R&D required for large-scale use of hydrogen as a chemical. But in the 20s, we should get on with the main game, which is pushing coal out of electricity, oil out of land transport, and gas out of heating.
Yeah.
And that's what we should be absolutely razor-sharp focused on.
Thank you.
We've got a question from Ellen. Thank you. You're on mute, Ellen.
Just another question about power cost. Did you have a reference for world power costs at the retail level to give me some comparisons between nations?
I don't really, and it's really hard to get accurate information. I mean, if you go to Indonesia, look up the wholesale price, you'll find it's subsidized. So, you know, what's the real power cost? I don't know.
No, I'm interested in at a retail level.
Oh, everything I've talked about is at the wholesale level, because retail includes a vast number of costs involved in reticulation from high voltage right down to the individual household.
Well, I'm still under the impression that we're higher than other nations in that retail level.
We might be, but that doesn't affect your decision to put in a wind or solar farm, because there you're competing at the wholesale. But it's wonderful for putting PV on your roof because you're competing at high retail prices.
Yeah.
Again, put PV on your roof.
It affects me if I'm a small business because I've got to pay the retail level.
But you put PV on your roof, and it's much cheaper than than what you buy from the grid.
So Andrew, can you see that area expanding? Derek speaking. More people putting more PV on their roof and maybe going off grid,
not going off grid, because then you've got to pay for storage to cover a week or so of cloudy weather. I mean, you can do that, but you've got to be prepared. You'd have typically a battery and a gen set to cover that week, which happens every few months. But staying on grid with 10 kilowatts on your house roof and 30 kilowatts on your business roof. In business in particular, is the solar day is matched to the business day in general, and with a battery you can store a bit for the evening peak or whatever. PV on your roof is going gangbusters in Australia. We're putting in about 2 to 2.5 gigawatts a year, which is faster than any other country. That's where most of Australia's solar is at the moment, on the roof.
excuse me, folks, but 11 o'clock has passed, and I said we'd try to be wrapped up by 11. So unless anybody else has got a pressing question, we need to press on, I guess.
So if you go to our website, you'll find a lot of information. If you just look up my name and ANU, you'll find it quickly. And there's papers, and there's popular articles, and there's the pumped hydro atlas, which you can go and search in your own backyard and see what it all looks like.
We've just got one last question from Ern Mahari, thanks.
Just a quick one. I think Graham's dog's got a question. Very interesting, Andrew. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. And thank you for the stimulating questions.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate that. So we'll all give him a little applause. Thanks, Andrew. That was great.
Thank you, Andrew.
And thank you all for coming along. And don't forget, this Saturday at 10 o'clock, we've got Darren Tinkler from Shepparton City Council. So thanks, folks. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Andrew.